So, Rabbi Tatz, thank you for joining us and agreeing to answer some questions which I've put together for the Finding Light Through Loss website. If it's okay with you, this talk's going to be Ilu Nishmas Shalamis Bas Ephraim Betzalel. And you're ready to get started.
Okay, sure. No, my pleasure to be here, and I'll do my best to answer the questions and explain the issues as best I can.
Fantastic. Thank you. So the first question is, in Torah, we obviously find grief and loss. But are there any examples that particularly stand out that we can really learn from and get a perspective of how to deal with this difficult concept of losing someone that we love? Any particular examples that stand out for you that you could share with us?
Yes, I mean, if you're looking for Torah examples, I presume, we certainly have this area detailed in Torah, just like we have every area. And going chronologically, I think the first thing probably that comes to mind is when Sarah died, when Abraham and Sarah, when she died, the Torah describes his response, and very interestingly, describes a measured response. He came to cry for her, and he wasn't at the place where she died, so he came to where she was. And the Torah tells us that he made a hesped, which is a eulogy, and he cried. And there the Talmudic sources make it plain that there was a measured grief. And this needs discussion. Maybe we'll have time to discuss it as we go through the questions, but that's the first point you note from that incident. I'll point out this: why should grief be measured? And I think it's a very, very, very positive message here from a Torah point of view, is that we do anticipate seeing that person again. In other words, we understand that the death situation is temporary. It is a very, very tragic and sad and theoretically, in the highest level, unnecessary tragedy that came to the world. No question about that. But it's not ultimately a breakdown. In other words, there'll be a resurrection, a recombination, reconstitution of families and relationships. By the way, family relationships will always remain. That means that even if someone has died in the world to come, the messianic resurrection and the subsequent world to come, those people will be part of the family. And therefore, an unlimited grief would be inappropriate, because it would suggest that there's no end to this suffering, and that's incorrect. And therefore, it needs to be, even grief needs to be balanced. So that, of course, takes us into a whole discussion of a resurrection and what it means and how we hope to. But by the way, I'd like to point out just one other thing at this stage, and that is that even stillborn children, even children never live to express themselves in the world, even pregnancies that were lost. We know that as long as the pregnancy progressed to a point where the child actually was formed as a child, so that will be also part of the family. In fact, it's very comforting for people to know who've been through the loss of pregnancies. And I must say, I know what this means. My wife and I lost two pregnancies, and in fact, one was a very beautiful little baby boy, and 5 months of pregnancy. I myself had to do a circumcision on that dead child before burying the child. That's the custom that we do. And we have a Kabbalistic teaching that before the Messianic era, there'll be a lot of miscarriages. And the reason is because all the souls that need to come down. And so they need to be put into a body, even if it's only for as long as, a pregnancy, but nevertheless, that needs to be. So this is a tragedy, obviously, to lose a pregnancy or a stillborn child, but nevertheless, there's nothing ultimately hopeless. It will have a purpose and a point, and we'll meet that child again. Without going here into reincarnation and why that has to be, but nevertheless, this is the idea. I wrote a piece on this, which you might want to post on your site, and that is an article on pregnancy loss and stillborn children, and some of the deeper and more mystical angles on that. And if you remind me, I'm very happy to send that to you. A second example.
Would love that.
Yeah, you asked for examples in Torah of loss. I mean, there are many that come to mind. One is the very, very evocative and poetic incident when Jonathan died. David and Jonathan had the most amazing love relationship. In fact, the Talmud says that two men could love each other more in one way than a man and a woman. They were the sort of paradigmatic example of a friendship love. And to read David's lament over Jonathan is the most amazing. How have the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perished? It's a very, very evocative. And from that you learn part of the concept of a response to death, and one of them is eulogy. Maybe I'll just say a word about that. The concept of a hesped, a eulogy. What is the purpose of that? What is the purpose of that? So Rabbeinu Bechaya, one of our great Torah commentaries, says that the idea of a hesped, a eulogy, believe it or not, is to sum up the essence of the person, to sum up who the person was. Now, obviously, you can't sum up a person in a few words, but if you can put your finger on some elements of essence, that is the purpose of the hesped. Why would you want to do that? There are many levels of meaning here, but one is to sum up the essence of this individual, meaning the unique gift they brought to the world, and then to take that as something that's an addition to your own spiritual armamentarium. So you sum it up and you take it away with you. To put it in the simplest terms, I would say to learn from this person for the uniqueness of what this person did. And therefore, it's very important in a eulogy, in Hesped, there are two things that are very important. One is to say only the truth. And the reason is because, Terry, when someone lives in this world and you say untrue things about them, I'll give you an example. When I go give a talk someplace, and it's customary to introduce the speaker. So they get up and they say all these praises about you, most of which are totally untrue. And it's delicious. I have no problem with it, The nicer they say about me, the better, But when you're in that world of truth, in the world of truth, so anything false is a terrible pain. Can you imagine the pain the soul feels in a world with absolute truth? And they're saying these, and therefore it's very important for the consideration to the soul of the person to say things that are good, but only 100% true. And the second point is that it's important to try to touch on the essence. Rav Moshe Shapiro, I heard from someone who used to spend a lot of time with him in Israel. Very often he would take him to a hesped of somebody famous or great or whatever who had died. And Rav Moshe would go out of respect to the person, whatever it was, and he was almost always terribly frustrated afterwards. He said, Lo paga velo noga. In other words, that hesped did not touch at all on the essence. There were flowery talks and great expressions of sadness and so on, but that's not the point. The point is to touch the essence. And when you listen to his hespedim, I have a recording of maybe 20 or 30 hespedim that he said on Rav Eliashiv and on some students of his and on Rav Shach, and they're masterpieces, absolute masterpieces of summing up what that person uniquely brought to the world. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit, but those are some initial responses to your first question.
We really appreciate those. I have questions on them, but I don't want to ask them because I want to carry on. So, I'm just one quick question on when you talk about the considered kind of grieving, the not excessive grieving, and just think about great people who've not been able to do that. The one that comes to mind for me, and I always get mixed up, it's the Rambam or the Ramban, who wrote the letter about losing his brother and kind of the Yesh and depression for 8 years. He was in bed and sick and etc. And thinking someone of his caliber and with his insight who knew this wasn't able to actualize that. So what a nisayon it is for us to grieve in a measured way.
Well, let's think about that. First of all, I think the tradition we have is the Rambam suffered for a year. I don't think it was 8 years. But when he lost his brother David, who was drowned at sea, his ship sank, it is true that I've actually seen, believe it or not, with my own eyes, the last letter that his brother wrote to him before he got onto that fated ship. He actually writes to him, I'm coming to see you. Wow. I'm about to board the ship. We were lost in the desert for some time. We finally survived. And he writes to his brother. This is you can see the letter actually in the Cambridge Geniza. Oxford and Cambridge have some original handwritten manuscripts of Rambam. I've actually been there to see them. And that letter, the last few lines are smudged and they think it's the Rambam's tears. And you can hold that in your own hand. It's an absolutely amazing thing. So yes, he suffered terribly from the death of his brother. I dare say that during that year of intense mourning, the Rambam still was producing some of his masterworks. So we're not talking about incapacitating. We're not talking about a person incapacitated by grief. But yes, he manifested the pain of the loss of his brother very, very strongly. That's true. We need to talk about why a year, why 3 months, how that all works. But yes, indeed. So you cannot always maintain perfect control. But, in the annals of Musa, which is in the annals of Musa, which is the that area of Torah which teaches us about perfect self-development, and we could also say perfect self-control. There is the notion that no matter how extreme an emotion, it always needs to be under control. You know, they say Rav Dessler's student, Rav Miller, who was the very gifted teacher of Rav Dessler's teaching in Gateshead, used to tell the boys about an incident which happened in Gateshead one year, where one of the Rosh Hashivas died. But that tragedy occurred during a Sheva Brachos. So they were sitting in the Sheva Brachos, and they were fulfilling the mitzvah of making the bride and groom happy. And the news came into some of them that the Rosh Hashiva had died. But the bride and groom didn't know about it. And to ruin their rejoicing at that moment was inappropriate. So here's what they did. There were people in that room rejoicing with the bride and groom, and then stepped out of the room trying to resuscitate the Rosh Hashiva who had died, without letting them know inside that was happening outside. And then they'd step back into the room with a smile on their face and continue the mitzvah of Mesameach Chasan V'Kala. In other words, what has to be done? In one room, there was a tragedy unfolding, and they responded appropriately. And the very same people, 2 minutes later, crossed the boundary into a room where the rejoicing was taking place, and they manifested that. And you know, it may seem superhuman, but some of us are called on to do that. Speaking personally as a rabbi and a doctor, how many times have I been in situations, you know what it's like to spend a day where you go at 8 o'clock in the morning to a bris, and from there you go to a family with a dead person lying in front of you when you have to be with the people, and from there you go into some surgical emergency, and from there you go into some Torah shir that has to be rhapsodic and emotional, and from there, can you imagine the roller coaster of emotions? And one has to ride that roller coaster and maintain control.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely felt that when my father passed away. 2 weeks later, we married a son. And the simcha was beautiful, you know, and we were able to kind of hook into the simcha mode from kind of the Avelis mode. And even now, my mother's getting remarried in Hashem this weekend. And, you know, we lost my sister 8 months ago. There's been a lot of loss, but you can celebrate a simcha, you know, and, you know, we can hold both. And which is part of, I guess, the Jewish neshama can do that.
First of all, Mazel Tov, and secondly, your family should not only joy. But of course it's like that. You know, our colleague, Rabbi Doron Perez, his son is missing in Gaza.
Yes.
And shortly after that, his other son, who was wounded in Gaza, they decided not to postpone the wedding. You know, can you imagine? The son got married. The other son is still unaccounted for. I mean, you know, we have to deal with these things.
Yeah, that was very inspirational watching that on Zoom. So, Rabbi Tatz, if someone dies young, a child or a young mother, people often say they've done what they needed to do in this world, or they were such a special neshama, and so they didn't need to be here for long. And I've often heard people say that isn't helpful, that isn't comforting, that it feels like a cliche, and it feels like, well, we didn't want them to be a special neshama. We didn't want them to complete. I remember even when my sister was dying, her little girl we were saying she's done what she needs to do in this world when she was dying. And she was like, no, we can find more jobs for her, you know? And so the thing I wanted to ask you is, firstly, is this true? Is there a Torah source for it? And I guess secondly, based on that, how do we comfort someone who's lost, you know, kind of a soul that was here for too short, seems like it was here for too short?
Well, this is really two questions. One question here is the question of dying young. That, of course, invokes the question of why people die at all. And the second question is comforting. How do you comfort people in general, and particularly people where the tragedy seems to be more poignant? So let's talk about that. This cliche about a person's done their work in the world and so forth is indeed over cliched, but if it is true, it is correct. Now, you need wisdom to know whether it's true or not, of course. So there are a few categories here. One category would be a person who wasn't a child, a person who lived a life and achieved certain things and died young. It is possible, and particularly where the death is, let's call it a natural death, by which I mean, let's say, an illness that had nothing to do with misbehavior, or a person, harmed their own health. Let's talk about the standard, straightforward challenge of a person who had some, an illness that had nothing to do with anything other than the fact that Hashem gave them that illness. So if the person meets certain criteria, not looking at this in a cliched way, that in fact could be true. Whether that's a comfort to the people who left behind or not is another question. Let me give you an example. My Rebbe, Rav Moshe Shapiro, right, one of the most amazing Torah personalities. I mean, right, here's a Rav Moshe, right, a very, very somebody beyond, I don't know, beyond normal standards of what we can grasp in terms of maturity and wisdom. So he lost a daughter who was 15, right? He had a daughter, Shulamit. She died when she was 15. And two outstanding things about her. One is she died very young, and the second is she was an amazing person, but truly outstanding and amazing person. And I happened to be present during the Shiva, when Moshe was sitting on the floor with his clothes torn, speaking Yiddish to Rav Heyman, who was the Rav of the Gross Shul in Beit Vegan. And I'll never forget that conversation. Rav Heyman was sitting close to Rav Moshe, and Rav Moshe was telling him about his daughter. And the story that he was telling painted a picture of an absolutely amazing and outstanding young lady. You know, he said that sometime before she died, she said to her father, Abba, I don't want you to be upset about this at all. There's no question I'm going to a better place than this. Right? So she was already comforting her father before. And then the day she died, she went to school. She couldn't breathe, but she figured, you know, if I'm going to die, I might as well be in Beis Yaakov. And so she struggled off to school and died that day. So you're talking about a very outstanding young woman. And then after he talked about her and painted that picture, he paused for a moment, and through his tears, he said to Rav Heyman, some people take 70 years to do what they need to do in the world, and some people take 15. Now, I'm quoting you that from Rav Moshe Shapiro, right? And he never spoke a cliche in his life. So if those are the facts and that is true, then indeed. And I think that was a comfort to him to feel that she came to complete some work in the world. And when it was done, Hashem took her away. That doesn't mean there's no tragedy here. Death itself is an amazing tragedy. And therefore, young life, where we read potential into it and we see it deprived and taken away, obviously that is tragic. And death, of course, is tragic. But nevertheless, there's also a mitzvah of seeing a broader picture. There's also a mitzvah of understanding and accepting comfort. In fact, it's a mitzvah on a mourner to receive tanchumim, which is comfort. And we need to discuss the mitzvah of comforting a mourner and how that can be done. But nevertheless, that remains true. The second aspect of your question is a person who never lived to fulfill mitzvahs, a person who was a child, maybe a baby. That sort of tragedy. What does it mean they did what they were meant to do in the world? So we have a very, very well accepted tradition. It's not so easy to find explicit sources for this, but it's certainly an authentic tradition. And I heard Rav Moshe Shapiro speak about this, that we have a Kabbalistic idea that a person who died without ever fulfilling a mitzvah or achieving anything from the perspective of their voluntary free will, like a baby or a stillborn child, is a completion of a previous cycle. In other words, we have an idea that souls are reborn, reincarnated in various ways. Perhaps this is not the time to go into a full discussion of Gilgul, but Gilgul means that souls come back to the world repeatedly. And it is indeed true. In fact, not only that, we have a whole work on this. We have a book called Shara Gilgulim, written by or transmitted by the great Arizal himself, going back to the 1570s. And in that work, which is an extensive work, he details the mechanisms of Gilgul and what they are for. And he says, for example, that a soul needs to come back to the world to fulfill and complete elements from a previous cycle that it never fulfilled. He goes so far as to say that a soul has to come back to fulfill every mitzvah in the Torah, amazingly. But not only to fulfill mitzvahs, also to complete issues that were left incomplete, which is a tremendous benefit to the soul. It's also a tragedy and a suffering that a soul needs to come back into the world. It means the work was not completed and fulfilled, but nevertheless it's an incredible privilege to be able to complete things that were left incomplete so that the soul is clarified in the higher world. And we have a number of examples of this. One example is there's a Gemara that says that when Rebbe, the great editor of the Mishnah, was walking in the marketplace one day, a calf ran up to him in distress. It was a calf on its way to be killed, to be slaughtered, and it put its muzzle under his coat and was obviously distressed. And Rebbe said to that animal, "Go, for this you were created." Meaning, your being shechted, killed at this point is necessary. That's what you were put into this world for. In fact, the Gemara goes on to say that Rebbe suffered for many years for that seeming insensitivity or cruelty of those words that he said to the animal at his great level, whatever that means. But the commentaries explain that this was a human incarnated into that animal. Note, not reincarnated as an animal. That's impossible. But locked in, so to speak, into the body of an animal, and the Arizal explains where that could happen and for which misbehaviors in previous lives that could happen. And Rebbe was saying to it, Indeed, you were brought into this incarnation to go through this experience. That's the last thing you need. What you're about to experience now will complete your tikkun. Of course, there may have been some incredible level of insensitivity, and he's great. And so if that and many other examples, you may be interested to know that the Arizal also says that women ordinarily do not get reincarnated. Indeed, he says that women, under normal circumstances, are corrected in the higher world without needing a reincarnation. Under what circumstances are women reincarnated? I'll mention it briefly. It's very interesting. You can look it up. I think it's in chapter 26 of somewhere around there, somewhere between 20 and 25, 26. He talks about Gilgul of women. And he says there's a statement of the sages in the Talmud that says Zibuk Sheni, which means second marriages, are very difficult. Second marriages are difficult. Arizal says that doesn't make any sense. Second marriages are often very good. People are more mature. They learn from their mistakes. What do you mean? Second marriage is often very good. And here we wish your mother every success, and I'm sure it'll be amazing. So what does this mean? He says you misunderstand. It doesn't mean a second marriage, people were divorced and married again. It means a first marriage in a second lifetime.
Yes.
In other words, here's a couple who were married, and then they died. The man then is brought back into another incarnation subsequently, because he has work to complete. Well, she's the other half of his neshama. So she needs to be brought down into that generation in another body to be available to marry him again, because this is a second marriage of a original two halves of a composite whole. And she gets upset with him. I had to come down again because you never finished your work. So she makes his life a misery because because she was...
I love that.
Anyway, that's
okay, but it feels like... But by the way, you should know, I'll just quickly as an aside, there was a question I asked Rabbi Smith, who we both Rabbi Smith, I asked him about, I said, I've always had one of the biggest fears since I've been little is about coming back again. It's almost like I don't understand it, but my soul almost feels it doesn't want to come back again. I've always said that. And anyhow, so you gave me a bit of nechama that unless Brian drags me back here, that maybe I won't have to come back again.
Well, the task is to make sure one's husband completes his work and becomes perfect in his lifetime, and then you can be.
I thought I needed to do that, but I'll make sure that he does it now. So I think the next question I'm going to ask is, why do some people have to suffer so much before they pass away, while other people seem to just die peacefully?
You know, that leads us to the question of suffering in general. The question of why people suffer, the death experience, the transition experience of death is only one version of suffering in the world. So the real question is suffering in general. But let's try to focus on the question of sufferings at the moment of death. So we know that suffering has to be a tikkun. Again, I'm not talking about suffering that's self-inflicted. I'm talking about suffering that is given to one. So if a person is dying, let's say there's an illness, there may be varying degrees of pain and suffering. And again, let's leave aside here feelings of abandonment and relationships that are sour. Let's just talk about the immediate question of a person maybe dying from an illness where there may be more pain or less pain. And again, that invokes another problem of the medical obligation, medical and halachic obligation to relieve pain. There are many, many dimensions here. But the pain that is suffered in the transition...
No, I was just going to say, my sister, we had exactly this, because hospice was really struggling to alleviate her pain because she had leptomeningeal and it was going through the kind of meninge in the nervous system. And she was, I mean, even if they, no matter how much morphine, she'd almost wake up and just, and she was begging us, like she was almost begging us to help her. And so that was, and they were saying there's a certain amount we can give her, which will kill her, and we can't do that. And so they were trying to manage that process. But just for us seeing her go through as much pain until she died, it looked to me like it was a kapara, like a cleansing of the body. That's how I was relating to it, almost like a final cleansing that she was going through. But I wasn't sure if that was just something I was telling myself, It felt true, though.
No, that is indeed true. But again, let's just take one side point here, speaking medically. We can actually deal with any degree of pain. It is true that some degree of pain relief may be dangerous, but halachically, there's no question it's obliged to do that. In other words, this takes us into a separate discussion, but halachically, one is obliged to relieve pain, even at significant risk to life. And that needs discussion and sources to be quoted. But what's much more difficult, speaking from experience, is not so much the physical pain, which we can almost always deal with. It is psychosocial suffering, which are things that are much more difficult to. There's no drug we can give that will cure a sense of abandonment or betrayal or being a burden on one's family. That's usually a much more difficult issue. But let me say, just in general, the suffering at the point of death, again, a general principle, is indeed a cleansing and a tikkun. Not only that, the Gemara goes so far as to say that when a person dies, even though we may not see it accurately, one of the 4 death sentence executions is being carried out. In other words, let's say a person would need to be executed. Again, we can't execute people, and this is a completely theoretical point for us. But let's say a person would need to be executed, and let's say the sentence would be an execution by strangling, let's say. So then what will happen to the person in the throes of death is Hashem will see to it that they die in that way. Again, we may not see it and we may not understand, but the one of the 4 death sentence executions of the Torah will be manifest in a way that the person dying needs in order to be a vehicle for a atonement or a expiation of whatever it is that they did. So again, it may be distressing to watch and obviously distressing to go through, but the consciousness we need is, number one, how can you alleviate it? There's no mitzvah to let people suffer, obviously. And the second is, yes, just like all suffering in life, the general principle is, if it's used correctly, it is indeed a fixing and an atonement. And that is the general answer to the question. You asked another question about comforting mourners, comforting people. The context of your question was children and people who die young. But let's talk briefly about the question of comforting mourners, which is both a mitzvah on the people who comfort and also a mitzvah on the mourners to accept comfort, what we call nechama. So I'd like to speak about this because people get this wrong and offend against this mitzvah in significant ways. The mitzvah is not to go there and have tea and biscuits and chat about irrelevancies. In fact, not only that, it is forbidden to deflect or distract the person. It's forbidden for a person. While going through the 7 days of mourning, there's an obligation to focus on the person who's left and not to be distracted. And therefore, what is completely and utterly wrong is to try to talk to the person about things that distract them from their mourning. That is not the concept of comforting. Furthermore, it is actually incorrect to speak to the person at all. The mitzvah of comforting a mourner is to simply present yourself so that you draw out what they want to express at that time and not to speak to them. It's simply to be there. So let's understand a little bit about what lies behind this mitzvah. There are 2 things to know. The first element is that mourning is a shrinking in of a person's boundaries and borders. Simcha, joy, is an expanded consciousness. In fact, the word simcha is the same letters as the word chamisha, which means 5. And the Maharal explains that 4 is always constrained. 4 always means the 4 limits of a flat world. In fact, daled in Hebrew, which means 4, is actually the same word as poverty-stricken, constrained, limited. And 5 is where you break out into another dimension. Simcha is an expanded. You notice when people are very happy, their boundaries extend. They want to put their arms around people, bring them in, include others in their joy. It's an expanded mindset or headspace. Avelis, mourning, is a shrunken consciousness where the world closes in on you and you are beaten down and locked into a small head. And therefore, the mitzvah of comforting person is simply to be there to help, give them opportunity to expand out of their boundaries. You sit there simply as an opportunity for them to relate outside of themselves and simply drawing them out. You know that real joy is experienced when you move beyond boundaries, when you move from one dimension to another. And therefore, that practically is what you are doing. But on a deeper level, the concept of nechama, which we translate in English as comforting, that's not the literal meaning of the word. Nechama in Hebrew means to change perspective. Like, for example, the Torah says, Vayinachem, Hashem regretted. Regretted means to see a thing differently. Again, the technical meaning of the word nechama in Hebrew means to change a point of view. It can be negative or positive. It can be regret, which means to take a positive view and then see it negatively. I shouldn't have done that. Or it can be taking a negative and converting it into a positive, right? For example, the Torah uses the same word in adjuring a person to go and get advice right from someone else. He should be, that means to take advice, which means to learn how to see the thing in a different way. The real mitzvah of comforting is not to tell the person to distract them. It's not to tell the person it's not so bad, or it's good they died because they were suffering. Those are not the right things to say. The concept of Nechama is to show them that this very tragedy has its own tikkun within it. In other words, the fact that we need to die in the world, right, which is a great tragedy, is a tikkun that's necessary because of the state of the world today. To give you a very simple example, if somebody's gone through an experience where somebody's, let's say, cut them, somebody's taken a knife and you cut their leg, okay? If you go and show the person that cut was called surgery, which saved their life, that's a whole different perspective. In other words, it was painful and tragic that it was necessary. But when you change the perspective, you change the meaning. And therefore, nechama means helping the person to see the life that has been lived. Maybe celebrate it, extract from it a meaning, understand that it has not ended ultimately and permanently. It's changing perspective that is the real concept of nechama. That's also one of the reasons that we speak about the person and draw out from them the positive aspects of the life that they live.
Yes, that's beautiful. Really beautiful. Love that. So I guess it leads perfectly into the next question, which is why I've always thought about this like on a spiritual level, because when we just look at the world, we understand why it's so painful to lose someone. We can look, we love them, they're not here. There's a kind of, we're never going to see them again. And there's a big hole and gap. But why on a spiritual level do we feel so much pain when we lose someone? What's going on spiritually for us? Like I once heard a talk with Rabbi Blachman talking about something about it's really a longing for the base of Mikdash or for the Gula, or like what's going on for us that it's so intense, that kind of pain when someone leaves this world.
There are many dimensions of answer to that question, and some are more obvious, like the fact that there's a separation, the other person is behind a veil or a wall, you can no longer connect with them. Again, that's not permanent, that will come to an end, but nevertheless there is that. One beautiful way to see that is, we use a very strange expression when we comfort people. We say, Hamakoim Yunachem Eschem. We say, God should comfort you. But the word we use for God is very unusual. We call God the place. Hamakom. That name is used, that concept, that appellation of Hashem is used in a number of places in Jewish life, but it's very, very rare. And here the question is, why do we say that God, representing place, will comfort you? Well, what is the notion there? And I'm not sure, but I think the reason is because when you refer to God as the place, that invokes in us the statement in the Talmud, in the rabbinic sources that say that the world is not God's place. God is the place of the world. People think that, the world is what it is and God is in it. God is what it is and the world's in him. So he's the place of the world. That's what our sages say. He's Mekayma Shel Olam. He is bigger than space and time. So the world fits into him, which means that this person has left you. They've died, they've moved on, they've left you, there's a separation. But the notion is they're in it with a larger vision of what space is. They may be in a different room now, not in the same room as you. They're in a different room, but they're in the house still. In other words, there's a broader sense of space that the person still occupies, and therefore, that's a tremendous comfort to think that I can no longer speak to them or touch them because they're no longer in the same room as me. They're in another room of the house, but at a bigger vision of what space is, there is a notion that they are still, in fact, there. Now, the sadness, of course, is that they're not with you to relate to. But let me tell you something a little bit deeper, which your listeners might find meaningful. The real reason for the aching pain of a loss is that the person experiencing that is moving in empathy with the experience of the soul that has died. Let me try to explain this. When a person leaves, they go through certain stages of pain. The pain is, for example, again according to Kabbalistic teachings, the moment that a person dies, they enter a zone of disorientation and discomfort. The reason is that they are used to inhabiting a body that responds and expresses them, and they're now not able to express themselves. And you can imagine, you just put yourself imagine you wake up in the morning, you reach out with your hand and the hand doesn't move. Then you try your other hand, that doesn't move
Yeah.
as well. Then you try to call out, and that doesn't work as
Yes.
well. Can you imagine? The consciousness is full, but the modes of expression have been
Yes.
paralyzed. That is extremely discomforting. And we again have a Kabbalistic teaching that lasts until the body's buried. As soon as the body's covered, technically, halachically,
Yes.
the grave has already been, that the reason that decreases the suffering of the soul, because at that point the soul somehow gets the idea that they're no longer in the world of expression, and there's an adjustment phase, and that's why it's cruel not to bury people. We are very fussed about burying people as soon as possible, and the deep reason for this, one of the deep reasons, is that it's an alleviation of the pain of this disembodied experience of seeing a body and experiencing a body that no longer is able to express itself. So that is the first stage of pain in the world. The next stage is the 7 days, during which, by the way, you know, you and I are both South African, and you know the South African Chevra Kadisha has a custom that's not done all over the world, and that is, as a person's wheeled out to be buried, as they move them from where everyone's gathered out to the place of burial, one of the assembled crowd, it's usually one of the rabbis, will stand in front of the coffin, the aron, and say, Teidalacha, no, you have no further share in the living. In other words, what's being said to the soul, by the way, this means, of course, that the soul of a person at that time can hear what's going on in the world, right? It's not like they disconnected from what's going on. We wouldn't talk to people who can't hear. There's nothing sentimental or, you know, sentimental about Judaism. If we speak to dead people, it means they're listening, which leads to another whole discussion about speaking to people who buried in the cemetery. That's another whole issue. But they say to the person, Teidalacha, you should know you no longer have a share in the living. In other words, we are trying to address the distress of a soul that feels it ought to be in the world with a body to respond, and yet doesn't have a body to respond. And the person hasn't been buried yet, and there's a very important adjustment stage that the soul needs to go through to move from a world in which they have a tool of expression into a dimension in which they do not. By the way, a little scary thought is that this distress of a person who dies is in direct proportion to how much they put the body front and center in their life. Let me explain what I mean. Let's say a person lives a life where their body is their consciousness. They are their body. They constantly exercising and working out and paying attention and adorning the body. Their whole consciousness is body. Imagine the pain of a person who dies and then realizes the body's not where it's at all. So the Gemara says like this, a person who operates in that mode, whose mode is the material, dying for them is like pulling burrs out of wool. You know, in South Africa, we used to call them blackjacks. You remember that? You walk in the field. These burrs that stick in your clothing. When you pull them out, it takes a bit of wool with them. So this person to die needs to go through a phase where they ripped out of this world painfully. A tzaddik, that means a person who lives in this world, and their consciousness is totally spiritual. Their body's only a necessary vessel and vehicle. The Gemara says for them, dying is like lifting a hair from a glass of milk. Absolutely painless. After all, if you wear your coat because you're cold, when you get to a warm place, you just take it off. You only need it when you get into the train because you need to get to destination. When you get destination, you get out of the train. When your body is a vessel and a vehicle that's carried you through life and you get to the end point, you just step out. There's no problem, right? You want to like to hear a particularly poignant version of this. The Gemara says that there was a man who spent the night in a cemetery. How and why is not for this discussion, but he spent the night in a cemetery and he heard the people buried speaking. Very interesting. And the Talmud records the conversations going on between the various people buried in that cemetery. And two of them happened to be two young girls. He heard two young girls, maybe teenagers, whatever it was, who had died, obviously, as teenagers, and he heard them talking. And here was the conversation. One of them said, please pass my comb. Another one said, please pass the makeup. And this man suddenly realized here are two young women, no face to paint, no hair to comb. But all they can think about is the cosmetics. Again, they lived a life, obviously, where the total consciousness was in external beauty. When you transition into another world, that's the consciousness. That's the agony. But a person who lives a life of value, where the body is only a vehicle, the next world is simply exiting the vehicle, right? So that is and then 7 days after death, the body travels from where it's buried to its home. And incidentally, as that transition occurs, why is the neshama doing that? Why is the soul traveling? It's looking for the place, so to speak, where it can be. Where does it live? Where does it belong? So the grave, on the one hand, is where it does belong at the moment. On the other hand, it tries to go home. And these waves can be felt by the person who's been left behind, emoting and empathizing with the spiritual connection of the person who has died. And therefore, the answer to your question of why the pain is during a mourning experience is because we are moving in empathy. We are feeling, due to that spiritual connection with the person, we are feeling the resonance of what that soul is going through. And that's why after 7 days, the mourning lessens, because the person has become more adjusted to their situation in that world, and therefore the resonance with the person left behind is less. 30 days later, that eases again. And in unusual circumstances like parents, that is a year, which we can discuss as well, why that is the case. And therefore, and let me add this, which is even more important. This has to be noted well. When the soul who has left the world has gone through these transitions on their spiritual journey, the one left behind, and the more closely related the one left behind, the more they feel that resonance of what the person's going through, should be converted into a mitzvah. The mitzvah is called Avelis. The mitzvah of mourning is going through steps that are a manifestation of resonance with the soul. For example, they can no longer move, you have no shoes. They cannot be presented in the world, your garments are torn. They cannot move in the world, you sit. They are silenced, you sit silently. Again, what's happened? The Rambam, listen to this. This is beyond amazing. The Rambam, who very seldom speaks about anything Kabbalistic and transcendent, he says this. The Rambam says the mitzvah of mourning is to help a soul. This is a parent who died. That person carried you. Now they've died unable to carry anyone. Your mitzvah now is to carry them. And when you act in empathy by fulfilling the halachas, the Jewish laws of mourning, you carry the soul. Listen to what the Rambam says. He says, if you fail to mourn halachically for a relative who died, you're guilty of cruelty. How much cruel? He uses the word achzariut. That means you could have carried them and helped their pain in that dimension that they are going through, and you didn't. Meaning, you have an obligation to, people think that mourning is coming to terms and it's psychologically healthy and Judaism is brilliant because it gives you that opportunity. That's fringe stuff. The essence of mourning is to go through a process that is carrying that soul on a journey, and therefore a person should collapse exhausted in bed after a night of Avelis with the agony and the wrenching pain, and at the same time, a joy. I did what I had to do today. I carried that person on a journey that was my job to do, and that is the work of Avelis.
Beautiful. I love that. Love that. So let me ask you a question, and I'm trying to choose because I can see we're going to run out of time, the ones, but this is almost a continuation because it's on my mind a lot. And it's something I've been curious about is the soul being around, as you say, because I heard, and I wanted to know what your take on this is, that in that year of kind of judgment or Gehinnom, that the soul's going through this cleansing process during the first year, the soul is around more, is more kind of, conscious of what's going on in this world. And, people say I'm talking to them, or I can feel them around me. But after that, not necessarily, because almost they don't need to be in contact with this world. They understand that this world is perfect. We're all doing what we need to do, unless we kind of almost call them down, through going to the grave or whatever it is. Because it feels like for people left behind, you want to feel like they're in the room and they're there. And people will often say, they're creating that shidduch, or they, as if they're meddling in this world and they're the reason why this happened. Is that kind of like Boba Masses, or what is our relationship to the soul? How much is the soul aware of what's going on here after it leaves?
There are a number of misconceptions there, but maybe let's cover this base first, and that why do we talk about a year, and why is that only for parents? Maybe let's cover that, and then we'll talk about some of the specifics that you raised. So that mourning, generally speaking, is only for a month. 30 days is mourning, that's it. Parents, we conduct ourselves in a certain way of respect for a year, not going to festive occasions and listening to music or dancing and so on and so forth. So this is very interesting. There's a responsum of Rav Moshe Feinstein in which he discusses this question, and he lays down the principle, which is brilliant to understand. There's no exceptions to mourning. Mourning is for 30 days. The reason we prolong that for a year does not fall under the concept of mourning. It falls under the concept of honoring a parent. So what you're doing when you act respectfully in that particular way for a year, at that point you've transitioned from fulfilling the din of mourning to the din of honoring a parent.
Yes.
Right? And the reason, of course, is the parent is the reason that you're in the world. Does this make a difference halachically? Indeed. Listen to this beautiful example. There was a woman in the United States who was married, and she was in the first year of mourning for a parent. And her husband very much wanted her to go to a certain wedding with him. A family wedding was very important to him. It was after 30 days, but it was in a year of mourning for her parents. Well, there was marital tension. On the other hand, she felt very, very much committed to the year of Avelis for a parent. So she wrote to Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe said, you should know that mourning only lasts for a month. The reason you are continuing what you're doing now is honoring a parent. A woman is exempt from honoring a parent when a husband wants her to be with him. Go to the wedding. Yeah,
it's amazing. Yeah.
So that's the unique position of a parent, which is for a year. Now it is true that for the first year, two important things happen. One is for the first year, indeed, a person may go through a more intense spiritual correction in the world to come. You mentioned the word Gehenna. In fact, we never discredit anyone with the assumption that they need a whole year in Gehenna. We only say Kaddish for 11 months. Nobody deserves a whole year. And probably there are people who may experience Gehenna, as the Gemara says, just a flash of a dip of transition from this world to another. But nevertheless, it is true that after a year, there's a certain step up in spiritual level. And in fact, we have a tradition that every year on the yard side, there's a transitional, shall we say, even a sense of judgment, after which the person is then ascending to another level. How do we mark that yearly moment of judgment? Depends which community you belong to. If you belong to the Hasidic community, you have a l'chaim, because this is a new level of life in that world. If you belong to the non-Hasidic community, you fast that day because there's a judgment going on. This is a classic dichotomy of how these two different spiritual visions in the Jewish people look at the same event. There's judgment and elevation. We fast because of the judgment. The Hasidim drink because of the elevation. But of course, they're both entirely true. But the next aspect of your question was really, does the person in that world see what is happening here? Are they in contact with our world? This is a sensitive point and needs to be understood. First of all, it's debated in the Talmud itself about whether they actively perceive what is doing in our world. And obviously the reason for that, as you readily understand, is there's really no reason for them to see what's doing here. They're going through the tikkun that they need. What is it? Why is it important for them to see what's doing in our world? There is an opinion in the Talmud. There's no real definitive answer to this, but it seems that they're not directly and permanently in contact with everything that's happening here. Believe it or not, there's one opinion in the Talmud that people in that world do know what's happening to their family because they get news from other people who die. When other people die and move into that dimension, they bring them news of what's happening with their family. However, it is important to know that at some unique occasions, the Zohar says at the wedding of a child or a grandchild, the parents or grandparents are in attendance. In other words, there's a chuppah set up and a child is about to marry, or a grandchild, or a great-grandchild, or a great-great-great-grandchild. There's a the Zohar says explicitly, the parents and grandparents and all the ancestors come to stand under that chuppah, present in the world at the time of the wedding. Now, and by the way, some communities, notably Hasidic dynasties, formally welcome the ancestors by name. I don't know if you've ever been to a Hasidic wedding with a badchan, or the person who's master of ceremonies. They will get up and make a Yiddish poem welcoming each ancestor by name to the chuppah. This is not fancy. This is based on the Zohar. Now, the question is, why do they need to be present at that time? And the answer is along these lines. When children get married, they are taking another step in the history of the family. Again, here are parents bringing a child under the chuppah. That's an extension of their life. The reason they married was to found a Jewish family, which is another step in the chain from Sinai to the final messianic redemption. So these children getting married are another step in the family. This is a step that the parents are taking. But obviously it's a step that the grandparents are taking too. They're present here because at this point their life takes a step forward. It is their life that is advancing by one step at this point when a new generation is being forged. And therefore, of course, they're present. This is their essence in the world that is now taking another step. And therefore, that is the teaching that they are. Now, can you speak to people in that world? Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is why we go to a grave and we can address people who are buried there. You know that when you enter a cemetery, you make a blessing in which you address the people who are buried. There's nothing sentimental or fanciful about Judaism. If you're speaking to people who are buried, and we have a teaching in Kabbalah that in the grave remains with the body a thing called the Havla de Garmi, a little bit of a vestige of the lowest part of the soul, investing the bones that are lying there, just enough to enable the Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection, to take hold. And therefore, yes, you can apologize to someone for something that happened in life. You can go and ask for forgiveness. It's best done at the graveside, because there is indeed some aspect of the presence of the person that still lives in that particular place. You went further and mentioned that some people say, well, you know, that person in that world is arranging the shidduch, etc. That's not correct. They're not doing anything in this world. The only one who's doing anything in this world is Hashem himself. There may indeed be a merit of a parent or an ancestor. Indeed, that's why we go and pray at the graves of tzaddikim, because there's a certain schus and a certain spiritual power that you can tag along with, absolutely. And that's fully justified. But under no circumstances to pray to the person who is buried. We speak only to God. But we could invoke the merit and the momentum of what they built up in the world.
Yeah, thank you. So tell me how much time we have left, because then I'm going to choose which question I'm going to be. That's going to help me choose.
3 minutes left, but go ahead and we'll wrap it up with it.
Okay, so what, we got one question, or can I get two in?
That depends how long I'll have to answer you.
Okay, so you have to answer short so we can get two in. So I wanted to know about how the Torah views sadness, because they say that a prophet or a Navi couldn't receive prophecy if they were sad. That they weren't like the Kli that could feel, that could receive prophecies. So does that mean that we can't connect to Hashem fully when we're sad?
This requires a long discussion of what happiness and sadness really are. Let me answer it in the briefly, only like this. You know, I just wrote a book called Shabbat and the Festivals. And in that book, there's a long discussion of happiness and sadness. The reason is because it's a mitzvah to be happy on a festival. That's a Torah mitzvah to be happy on a festival. And so there you'll find, let me refer your listeners to extended discussion in that book. There's also a lecture on my website, which is called Joy, I think it's called Happiness, or you'll find a title that includes that word, and that's a full analysis of the subject. But let's say only, in very brief form, the Jewish obligation is always to be happy. Sadness really means a lessening in the joy, but there should always be a joy. And as you perfectly put it, a prophet, even a Jeremiah, writing about the unspeakable horrors that he was warning the Jewish people about, must have been experiencing a joy at the same time, or he couldn't have heard his prophecy. And but for that, you need to be what we call extremely well adjusted. That means to know that you're doing exactly what you need to be doing, no matter how painful. Within the pain is to feel a joy as well. Let me leave you with this thought. The Ralbag says that when Avram Avinu, Abraham, was about to kill his own child, because that's what God asked him to do, he was feeling the joy of fulfilling a mitzvah, along with the pain of the death of his child. Right? Why? It is very immature to think that he was about to sacrifice his child, resentful and conflicted. We're not talking about that. He was about to fulfill the mitzvah with all the agony that it would entail, with the joy of serving Hashem. You know, the two proofs for this. The Ralbag himself brings an incredible proof. As Avram was about to kill Yitzhak, he heard a voice calling out to him from the higher world to stop. A prophet cannot hear that voice if he's distressed. And therefore he must have been feeling joy. And the Sfardim have the most beautiful piyut on Yom Kippur. We don't have it in our Ashkenazi Machzor, but the Sfardim have the most beautiful piyut about the Akedah, the killing of Yitzchak on the altar. And listen to what it says. It says, Ayin b'mar bocha, an eye crying with bitter tears for the death of his child, v'lev sameach, and a heart joyful at fulfilling the mitzvah. So a well-adjusted person can feel agony, but an underlying mode of joy at being in the world and doing what you need to be doing. This requires a fuller discussion, but that's a brief answer.
So Rabbi Tatz, we're going to squeeze in one more question that you've kindly allowed for. And that is one that comes up for a lot of people. And I know it was something that I grappled with when my sister was dying. When someone's in that palliative stage and is clearly dying, are we still supposed to believe that Hashem can create a miracle and give them a refuah? Or are we supposed to accept that this is their time? It's now their time to go, because there's almost a different emotional space that you have when you're in the one as opposed to the other. And there's also different practical things you do when you're in the one as opposed to the other. So how do you do that? How do you know which to be in and when to switch? Would you hold both?
Right. Okay, there are a lot of elements here, but first of all, the practical. Let me sum it up in a pithy, brief statement, and then try to fill it out a little bit more. We are hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. Say it again. Hoping for the best, praying for the best, and yet realistically preparing for the worst. That is a well-adjusted and correct way to handle the situation. So in a bit more depth, yes, one is required to believe that Hashem can produce a miracle. If you challenge that by saying we don't rely on miracles, this type of miracle does not fit into that category. In other words, let me make it as clear as I can. When someone's died, you cannot hope for a miracle they'll come back to life. That is not legitimate, and we live in an era where those sorts of miracles are not real, and we cannot invoke them, and we should not be. But when someone's desperately ill, they could recover. That type of miracle certainly can happen in the world. And the reason is, it happens occasionally. It may happen 1 in a million times, but it's not, again, the miracles we're not allowed to rely on or even pray for are miracles that subvert a law of physics, a law of nature. The fact that a desperately ill person could make a seemingly miraculous recovery, all of us doctors have seen that. Right? Very seldom. But it could happen, and therefore, no question that could happen, and one prays for the best. Who knows whether your prayer will help them recover, live 5 minutes more, another day, suffer less? We don't know, and therefore, we take the attitude that we never give up hope. In fact, the halachic approach to that is if a sword is on your neck on its way down, you do not give up hope. So it's forbidden. In fact, you mentioned hospice at one point. There are some hospices that are absolutely forbidden to use for Jews. And those are the hospices that definitively give no treatment and prepare only for death. That is taking away hope.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When people enter that establishment, they might as well write over the door, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. No, you are never allowed to take away hope. And the dying person as well must never be deprived of hope. So, realistically, yes, if the person's spiritually strong and they ask you what's going to happen, are they going to die? The correct answer is, we're all going to die. We don't know exactly when. We do not, we prepare for it, absolutely. We say the vidui, absolutely, but God could do anything. And therefore, we are giving a message of hope. We are realistically preparing for whatever might happen. We are praying for the best. We specifically at time should change our focus for praying for less suffering. And if you ask me technically, could you pray for someone to die? Yes, there are circumstances where one may, but 2 important caveats. First of all, not recommended. We should not be thinking along those. Again, when someone is hopelessly ill and suffering terribly, and the only option is dying sooner with less suffering, technically and theoretically, one could pray for them to die. However, that should generally speaking not be done. Secondly, you'd have to know with absolute perfect certainty that there's no hope anyway. And even then, what's brought in halacha is family members should not do that. Family members should not do that. Because family members, who knows what vested interests they may have, and who knows, possibly other people might be able to do that. But in practice, what we are doing is always praying for the best, hoping for the best, never depriving a person of hope. You know, even when you say vidui with someone, that is the last confession. The way you begin is like this. Look in the Siddur. The way it's written is like this. You say, Hashem, my life and death are in your hands. May it be your will that I recover. You start positively. But if I die, let my death be an atonement, and then you say your confession. And when you break bad news to a person, there's a halacha, the way you break the bad news. You don't say you know you're dying. You say, many have been in your situation and recovered. Now, in case you don't, here's what we need to do. So we always give a positive, we always start with a positive thing. So those are some of the obligations from a, let's call it, palliative point of view. I wrote a book about this. That's called Dangerous Disease and Dangerous Therapy in Jewish Medical Ethics, and it lays out the principles and practice of medical and psychological palliative issues, among other issues.
We're going to post that. I think it's even already on the website, so people can refer to that. Thank you, Rabbi Tatz. Really appreciate that.
Your listeners might find it interesting. I recently published an article in the British Journal of Hospital Medicine, which is a digest of the Jewish approach to palliation and end-of-life care, written mainly for a non-Jewish medical audience. But I'm very happy for you to, when Jews are going through circumstances like that, where the attending medical team might not be sympathetic, you can give them an article like that, which comes from a respected, non-Jewish journal, and show them this is what Orthodox Jews sort of believe, to improve the communication between the medical staff and the family.
Fantastic. We actually got that article up as well, so people can. It's already up there. So thank you, Rabbi Tatz. Really appreciate your time.
Pleasure. All the best.